I should have known that garage would change everything. The way memory works, it crystallizes certain moments, makes them feel inevitable even when you couldn't see them coming. That Tuesday afternoon in June feels like that now. Heavy with the weight of everything that came after, though at the time, it was just another trip to get my car looked at. The heat hit me first when I pushed through the door. Not just summer heat, but the thick metallic warmth that lives in places where engines run and metal bends under pressure. The air tasted of motor oil and rust, cut through with something sharper, brake fluid, maybe, or the acrid bite of welding from somewhere deeper in the shop. A box fan rattled in the corner, pushing the heavy air around without really cooling anything, just redistributing the weight of it. I've been coming to Rodriguez Auto for 3 months by then. Started when my check engine light came on back in March. That first panic of car trouble when you're 21 and still learning how expensive freedom actually costs. But I kept finding reasons to return. A weird noise that turned out to be nothing. Tires that probably had another 1,000 miles left in them. Oil changes that came maybe a week too early. I told myself it was about being responsible, taking care of things before they broke completely. The responsible thing to do when you're finally old enough to own something worth maintaining. But standing there in that doorway, watching Damien bent over the open hood of someone else's car, I knew that wasn't the whole truth. Maybe wasn't even half of it. He moved like someone who'd grown up with his hands dirty. Not rushed, not careful exactly, but with the kind of confidence that comes from understanding how things work at their most basic level. His dark hair was already damp with sweat despite the early afternoon hour, and there was grease under his fingernails that I'd noticed the first time he'd handed me back my keys. Working hands. Honest hands. I'd spent most of my life around clean spaces. Dorm rooms and lecture halls. Libraries where the loudest sound was pages turning or keyboards clicking. Controlled environments where everything had its place and purpose. The garage felt like the opposite of all that. Chaotic in a way that made sense, full of the kind of productive messiness that happens when you're actually building something, fixing something, making something work. He looked up when he heard the door, and his face shifted into that easy grin I'd been thinking about more than I should have. "Hey, Eli," he said, like he was actually glad to see me. Not surprised, not annoyed that I was back again so soon. Just pleased in a way that made something warm unfurl in my chest. "The Honda's running fine," I told him, which was true. "She's just been making this sound when I brake. Probably nothing, but I wanted to be sure." He nodded, wiping his hands on a rag that had seen better days. "Let me finish up here, and we'll take a listen." He gestured toward a plastic chair near the workbench. "You can wait if you want, or I can call you when she's ready." I should have said I'd come back. Should have walked out that door and driven to the campus coffee shop. Spent the afternoon reading or pretending to study. Should have let him do his job without me hovering around, watching the way his shoulders moved when he leaned into his work, or how he sometimes caught his bottom lip between his teeth when he was concentrating. Instead, I sat down in that plastic chair and pulled out a book I'd been carrying but not really reading. Told him I didn't mind waiting. The truth was, I minded being anywhere else. I watched him work over the edge of my book, trying to be subtle about it, but probably failing. There was something hypnotic about the rhythm of it, the careful way he tested connections, the methodical process of elimination that led him from problem to solution. His movements were economical, purposeful. No guasti motion. When he finally closed the other car's hood and turned to mine, I felt that little flutter of anticipation I'd been trying not to examine too closely. Like being called on in class when you know the answer, but bigger somehow. More personal. "Your turn," he said, pulling my keys from a board by the register. "Let's see what she's trying to tell us." I followed him outside to where my car sat in the afternoon sun, already knowing this was probably going to be nothing. The brakes had been making that soft whistle for weeks, but only sometimes and only when I was going slow. The kind of minor annoyance you learn to live with because it's easier than dealing with it. But when he popped the hood and leaned in to look, I found myself stepping closer than I needed to. Close enough to smell the faint scent of soap under the oil and sweat. Close enough to see the small scar on his forearm that I'd noticed before but never had a reason to study. "Here," he said without looking up, "hand me that flashlight on the bench." I reached for it, leaning across him to get a better angle, and that's when it happened. My wrist brushed against something sharp and hot, part of the engine block that hadn't had time to cool down completely. Not enough to hurt, really just a quick scrape that left a dark streak across my skin. I pulled back with a small sound of surprise, looking down at the grease smudged across my wrist like a small badge of this place, this moment. Damien straightened immediately, his attention shifting from the engine to my hand. "Let me see," he said, already reaching for the rag in his back pocket. "It's fine," I started to say, but he was already taking my hand in his, turning it gently to get a better look at the mark. His hands were warm and rough with calluses bigger than mine in a way that made me suddenly aware of how soft my own were. College hands. Hands that held pencils and turned pages, but didn't build anything, didn't fix anything, didn't know the satisfaction of making something broken work again. He wiped at the grease with careful strokes, his thumb moving slow across my wrist. The mark came away easily. It hadn't really set in, was mostly just surface dirt and oil. But he kept wiping, kept holding my hand in both of his, even after there was nothing left to clean. I should have pulled away. Should have said thanks and stepped back, put some normal distance between us. Should have made some joke about not being built for manual labor, something to break whatever was building in the space between us. Instead, I stood there and let him hold my hand, let him study my wrist like it was something precious that needed protecting. Let myself notice the way his breathing had changed, gotten slightly deeper, slightly slower. The fan rattled from inside the garage. A car passed on the street behind us. Radio playing something I couldn't quite make out. Normal afternoon sounds, life continuing around us while we stood frozen in this moment that felt separate from everything else. His grip tightened slightly, his thumb still moving across my skin, even though there was nothing left to wipe away. When he finally looked up, his eyes held something I'd been hoping to see, but afraid to name. The air between us felt different suddenly. Charged, like the moment before a summer storm when you can taste the change coming. He didn't let go of my hand. I didn't ask him to. I drove home with my wrist still tingling where he'd touched it. The brake noise was gone. Turned out to be nothing more than a small stone caught in the rotor, something that took him all of 30 seconds to fix once he actually looked. But I kept replaying those minutes when his hands held mine, kept feeling the phantom pressure of his thumb moving across my skin. That night, lying in my narrow dorm bed with my roommates, breathing steady in the darkness across the room, I tried to make sense of what had happened. The rational part of my mind, the part that had gotten me through calculus and organic chemistry, that planned my schedule 3 weeks in advance and color-coded my notes, insisted it was nothing. Mechanics touch things all day. Fixing, adjusting, cleaning. It was probably automatic for him, just another small repair in a day full of them. But my wrist still held the memory of his calluses, still felt warm where his thumb had lingered. And there had been something in his eyes when he finally looked up, something that made the ordinary afternoon feel charged with possibility. I'd always been careful, cautious, the kind of person who read the syllabus twice and finished assignments early, who checked and double-checked before making any decision that might matter. It came from growing up as the quiet one, the one who watched other people take risks and make mistakes while I stayed safely on the sidelines. College was supposed to be different, a place where I could figure out who I was when nobody was watching, when I didn't have to be anyone's version of the good kid. But even here, in a city 2 hours from home, where nobody knew my high school reputation or my parents' expectations, I found myself playing it safe, studying instead of partying, eating lunch alone with a book instead of trying to make conversation with strangers, keeping my head down and my thoughts to myself. The garage was different, though. In Rodriguez Auto, surrounded by the honest smell of oil and the productive chaos of work being done, I felt like I could breathe differently, like there was space for a version of myself I'd never tried on before. Damien belonged there in a way I'd never belonged anywhere. He moved through that space like someone who'd grown up understanding that things were meant to be used, meant to be tested until they broke, and then fixed until they worked again. There was no hesitation in him, no second guessing, just a quiet confidence that came from knowing exactly what you were good at. I'd watch him work and wonder what that felt like, to have your hands know something so completely that thinking wasn't required. To trust your instincts because they've been proven right more often than wrong. to live in your body instead of just carrying it around. Most of the guys in my program were like me, careful, academic, more comfortable with theories than practice. We talked about hypotheticals and debated abstracts, spent our time in libraries and computer labs where the biggest risk was a failed test or a late assignment. Safe spaces where mistakes could be erased, where you got second chances and extra credit. Damien's world didn't work that way. In the garage, mistakes had consequences. Bad repairs meant broken down cars and unhappy customers. Carelessness could mean injury, could mean damage that couldn't be undone. There was something appealing about that level of reality, that immediacy, something that made my careful, planned-out life feel a little bloodless by comparison. He'd grown up here. I learned over those first few visits. Not in this exact shop, but in places like it. His father had been a mechanic, his grandfather too. He told me about summer afternoons spent handing his dad tools, about learning to change oil before he could reach the pedals, about the satisfaction of diagnosing a problem that had stumped someone else. There's something honest about engines, he said one afternoon while I pretended to read in my usual chair. They don't lie to you. If something's wrong, they tell you. Might not tell you in words, but they tell you. You just have to know how to listen. I wondered what it would be like to have that kind of clarity. To live in a world where problems announce themselves and solutions were a matter of knowledge and patience rather than luck and guesswork. My problems felt murkier, harder to diagnose. Questions about what I wanted to do with my life, about whether I was studying the right things, about why I felt more at home in this noisy garage than anywhere on campus. Questions about why I kept inventing reasons to come back here, and why the highlight of my week had become watching someone work on cars I didn't really understand. But sitting there in that plastic chair, listening to the rhythmic sounds of repair and maintenance, watching Damien's steady hands work magic on mechanical problems, I felt something settle in my chest. A kind of peace I hadn't realized I'd been missing. This was the first place I'd found where being quiet wasn't a problem to be solved, where I could sit and observe without anyone asking me to speak up, to contribute, to prove I belonged. Damien never seemed to mind my presence. If anything, he seemed to work a little slower when I was there, took time to explain what he was doing, pointed out the small elegances of a well-running engine. The grease on my wrist had washed off that first night, disappeared under hot water and soap like it had never been there. But the memory of his touch stayed, and with it the growing certainty that I was crossing some line I couldn't uncross. That whatever was building between us in the spaces between conversation, in the lingering glances and careful distances, was something I wanted to explore even if I didn't know how to name it yet. I lasted exactly 1 week before I found another excuse to go back. This time it was the air conditioning. Summer was settling into the valley like a weight. Those California days where the heat starts building before dawn and doesn't break until well after sunset. My car's AC had been running fine, but I convinced myself I heard something, a slight rattle when the compressor kicked on, barely noticeable, but there nonetheless. At least, that's what I told myself as I pulled into the gravel lot outside Rodriguez Auto on Thursday afternoon. The real reason sat heavier in my chest, harder to name, but impossible to ignore. I'd spent the week replaying that moment when Damien had held my hand, analyzing it like a problem set, trying to solve for variables I didn't fully understand. The rational explanations felt thin in daylight. Maybe he was just being kind. Maybe he always took that much care with customers. Maybe I'd imagined the weight in his touch, the way his breathing had changed when our eyes met. But maybe I hadn't. The shop was quieter than usual when I walked in. Just Damien working alone under the hood of an old pickup truck, radio playing something low and indistinct from the back corner. He looked up when he heard my footsteps, and that same easy smile spread across his face. "Back so soon?" he asked, straightening up and wiping his hands on the eternal rag. "Don't tell me the Honda's giving you trouble already." I explained about the air conditioning, about the sound that might or might not be there, feeling foolish even as the words left my mouth. He listened without interruption, nodding like my concern was completely reasonable, like people came in all the time worried about noises that probably didn't exist. "Let's take a look," he said, reaching for my keys. Though I have to say, Eli, you're starting to baby that car more than most people baby their kids. There was something different in his voice when he said my name. something warmer than customer service, more personal than professional courtesy. It made the sound familiar in a way that settled something anxious in my chest. We walked out to where my car sat in the afternoon heat, and he popped the hood with practiced efficiency. But when he leaned in to listen to the engine, he gestured for me to come closer. "Here," he said, "listen for yourself. Tell me what you're hearing." I stepped beside him, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his body, close enough to catch that scent of soap and honest work that I'd started associating with this place. The engine hummed steadily, the air conditioning cycling on and off with its usual mechanical rhythm. "I don't hear it now," I admitted, feeling heat rise in my cheeks that had nothing to do with the temperature. He nodded, still listening intently. "Sometimes these things are intermittent. Depends on the load, the temperature, how long you've been driving." He straightened up and looked at me directly. "Why don't you stick around while I finish up with the truck? We could take yours for a test drive later, see if we can replicate the problem." The suggestion hung in the air between us, casual on the surface, but carrying an undercurrent I couldn't quite name. A test drive meant time together away from the shop, just the two of us in the enclosed space of my car. It meant prolonging this visit beyond what was strictly necessary. "Sure," I said, trying to sound equally casual. "I've got time." Back inside, I resumed my position in the plastic chair while he returned to work on the pickup. But something had shifted since my last visit. The silence felt different, not awkward, but charged with unspoken possibility. I found myself watching him more openly, and occasionally I'd catch him glancing in my direction when he thought I was absorbed in my book. He worked slower than usual, I noticed. Took more time explaining what he was doing, pointing out the elegant engineering of a well-designed engine, the way different systems work together to create something greater than their individual parts. "It's like a conversation," he said at one point, hands deep in the truck's engine compartment. Each component talking to the others, telling them what it needs, what it can provide. When everything's working right, it's this perfect harmony. When something's off, the whole system knows. I set down my book, genuinely interested despite myself. "How do you learn to hear what they're saying?" He paused, considering the question seriously. "Time, mostly. Patience. You start to recognize the different sounds, the way problems announce themselves. But mostly you have to trust your instincts. Stop overthinking and just listen." The advice felt like it applied to more than engines. I thought about all the ways I'd been overthinking lately, analyzing every interaction between us for hidden meaning, second-guessing impulses I'd never had to examine before. When he finally finished with the truck, the afternoon had mellowed into early evening. The shop felt different in this light, softer somehow, more intimate, like a space transformed by the approaching end of day. "Ready for that test drive?" he asked, washing his hands at the small sink in the corner. My heart did something irregular in my chest. "Ready," I said. He dried his hands and reached for my keys, but this time when he handed them over, our fingers brushed for just a moment longer than necessary. Not an accident, not the natural contact of two people exchanging objects. Something deliberate. Neither of us acknowledged it directly, but the awareness hung between us as we walked toward my car. He opened the passenger door and slid in while I adjusted the driver's seat, hyper-aware of his presence in the small space beside me. "Let's see if we can find that noise," he said, buckling his seatbelt. But as I started the engine and pulled out of the lot, I realized I'd stopped caring about mechanical problems entirely. The only sound I was interested in was the change in his breathing, the small intake of air when our hands accidentally touched as I reached for the radio. The only problem I wanted to solve was the growing certainty that whatever was building between us couldn't be diagnosed with tools or fixed with replacement parts. It required something else entirely, something that felt like courage. The test drive revealed nothing wrong with my air conditioning, just as I'd known it would. We drove through the quiet streets beyond the shop, windows down despite the AC running perfectly, letting the evening air carry the sounds of a neighborhood settling into dusk. Damien listened intently to the engine, occasionally asking me to accelerate or slow down, to turn the AC on and off, but his attention felt divided, like he was listening for something else entirely. When we got back to the shop, he declared the system perfectly fine. "Just one of those intermittent things," he said, but his eyes held a knowing look that made me wonder if he'd seen through my excuse from the beginning. That night marked a change between us, though neither of us named it directly. My visits stopped pretending to be about car trouble. I started coming by in the late afternoons when the shop was quieter, bringing a book I'd barely read, settling into what had become my chair while he worked on other people's problems. He never questioned it, never asked why I was there or suggested I might have better things to do. Instead, he seemed to welcome the company, working a little slower when I was around, taking breaks to explain what he was doing or to ask about whatever I was pretending to read. The conversations were easy in a way that surprised me. He talked about growing up in his grandfather's shop, about learning to drive in cars that barely ran, about the satisfaction of bringing something broken back to life. I found myself telling him about college, about the pressure of choosing a major when you weren't sure what you wanted your life to look like, about feeling lost in spaces that were supposed to feel like home. We developed a rhythm over those weeks. I'd arrive sometime after 4, usually with coffee for both of us from the place down the street. He'd finish whatever repair he was working on, then find small tasks that let him stay near where I was sitting, organizing tools that didn't need organizing, cleaning parts that were already clean, inventory that could have waited until morning. The touches became more frequent, more deliberate. When I handed him a wrench, our fingers would linger. When he showed me how something worked, his hand would rest on my shoulder just a moment longer than necessary. Small gestures that felt enormous in the charged space between us. One Thursday evening in late July, I brought him a socket wrench he'd asked for, and instead of taking it from my hand, he guided my fingers around it, showing me the proper grip. His palm covered the back of my hand, warm and slightly rough with calluses, and for a moment we both went still. The shop felt quiet around us despite the ever-present hum of the fan. Golden light slanted through the west-facing windows, catching dust motes and giving everything a soft, dreamlike quality. His thumb moved slightly against my knuckles, just the smallest pressure, and I felt my breath catch. We stayed like that for longer than we should have, his hand covering mine, both of us staring down at our joined fingers like we were studying some complex mechanical problem. When he finally looked up, his eyes held a question I wasn't sure I knew how to answer. The moment stretched between us, full of possibility and risk in equal measure. I could feel my pulse in my throat, could hear the slight change in his breathing that matched my own. The air felt thick with everything we hadn't said, everything we'd been building toward through weeks of careful proximity and deliberate contact. Then the shop phone rang, cutting through the tension like a blade. We jerked apart, the spell broken by the harsh electronic sound. Damien cleared his throat and moved to answer it, leaving me standing there with the socket wrench still in my hand, my palm tingling where his had been. But something had shifted. The phone call was brief, someone asking about hours, nothing that required more than a minute of his attention. But when he hung up, the easy intimacy of the moment before fell harder to reclaim. We were both suddenly aware of what had almost happened, of the line we'd been approaching without quite crossing. I should probably head back, I said, though neither of us moved toward the door. Yeah, he said, but his voice was rough in a way that made my stomach flutter. Probably. The next week, I found myself arriving earlier, staying later. The pretense of the book disappeared entirely. Instead, I'd help where I could, holding flashlights, organizing tools, learning the names of parts I'd never heard of. My hands got dirty for the first time in years, picked up small cuts and bruises that felt like badges of belonging. He taught me to check oil levels, to recognize the sound of a belt that needed replacing, to feel the difference between a loose connection and one that was properly seated. Patient instruction delivered in that steady voice, his hands guiding mine until the movements became natural. But it was the quiet moments that mattered most. When he'd catch me watching him work and hold my gaze just a beat too long. When our shoulders would brush as we leaned over an engine together. When he'd pass me a tool and let his fingers trail across my palm. The transformation was gradual but undeniable. I stopped thinking of myself as a visitor to his world and started feeling like I belonged there. Started understanding why he loved the honest simplicity of mechanical problems, the satisfaction of diagnosis and repair. Started recognizing that what was building between us followed the same logic. The careful attention to detail, the patience required to understand how things worked, the trust needed to put your hands on something delicate and make it better. The revelation came on a Tuesday evening when the summer heat had finally broken, leaving the air soft and breathable for the first time in weeks. I've been coming to the shop for almost 2 months by then, and what had started as careful visits had become as natural as breathing. Part of my routine, part of my day's rhythm. I arrived to find Damien working alone on a stubborn transmission, sweat beading his forehead despite the cooler temperature. The radio played something low and bluesy from the corner, and the shop felt more intimate than usual in the golden light filtering through the west windows. He looked up when I walked in, that familiar smile spreading across his face, but there was something different in his expression, something more focused, more intense. Like he'd been waiting for me specifically, not just for closing time or the end of another workday. "Hey," he said, straightening up and reaching for his usual rag. "Was hoping you'd stop by." The words hit me differently than his normal greeting. More personal somehow, weighted with intention I couldn't ignore. I set down my coffee and the book I'd brought out of habit, moving closer to where he was working. "Transmission trouble?" I asked, though I was learning to recognize the different types of problems by sight now. The careful way he was approaching this one told me it was complicated, required patience rather than force. "Yeah, she's being stubborn." He gestured toward the engine bay. "Sometimes you have to convince them instead of commanding them. Show them you understand what they need." I watched him work for a while, noting the deliberate gentleness of his approach, the way he listened to each sound the machinery made. There was something almost meditative about it, this careful conversation between his hands and the machine's resistance. When he needed a different tool, I handed it to him without being asked. We developed this wordless communication over the past weeks, an understanding of rhythm and need that felt natural despite how recently we'd learned it. But when our fingers brushed during the exchange, he didn't pull away immediately like he usually did. Instead, he held the contact, his thumb moving across my knuckles in that same slow, deliberate way he approached difficult repairs. The transmission forgotten for a moment, he turned his full attention to my hand in his, studying it like he was memorizing the shape of my fingers, the pattern of small scars I'd acquired from learning to work alongside him. I should have said something. Should have made some joke about the grease that was permanently embedded under my fingernails now, or commented on how different my hands looked after weeks of actual work. Should have filled the silence with words that would make this moment safe, ordinary, explicable. But I didn't want it to be safe anymore. Instead, I let him hold my hand, let him trace the line of grease across my wrist that had become as familiar as my own reflection. When he looked up, his eyes held a question that had been building between us for weeks, maybe since that very first afternoon when he cleaned the smudge from my skin and hadn't let go. This time, there was no phone to interrupt us. No customer walking through the door, no mechanical crisis requiring immediate attention. Just the two of us in the quiet shop, the radio playing softly, the transmission waiting patiently for his return. The question in his eyes was clear enough that even I, with all my careful overthinking and need for certainty, couldn't misinterpret it. But he asked anyway, his voice rough with something that might have been nervousness or hope or both. "You keep coming back," he said quietly, his thumb still moving against my skin. "And it's not just the car, is it?" The words hung in the air between us, honest and direct in the way everything about him was honest and direct. No pretense, no careful maneuvering around the truth. Just the question that had been living in the space between us, finally given voice. I could have deflected, could have made some excuse about enjoying the conversation, about learning new skills, about finding the garage peaceful after long days on campus. Could have preserved the careful ambiguity that had let us dance around this moment for weeks. But sitting there with his calloused fingers warm against mine, looking into eyes that held no judgment, only patient waiting, I found I didn't want to deflect anymore. Didn't want to pretend this was about anything other than what it actually was. "No," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "It's not just the car." The admission felt enormous in the quiet shop, like something that couldn't be taken back once spoken. But instead of the fear I expected, I felt relief. The kind of deep, settling calm that comes when you finally stop fighting something you can't change anyway. He nodded slowly, like my answer confirmed something he'd already known. His grip on my hand tightened slightly, and I realized we'd crossed some invisible line we'd been approaching since that first afternoon. Not just in what we'd said, but in what we were allowing ourselves to want. "I know," he said simply. "I was just waiting for you to figure out." The honesty of it, the patient certainty in his voice, made something shift inside my chest. Made me understand that all my careful analysis and overthinking had been unnecessary. That some things didn't need to be solved like equations or diagnosed like mechanical problems. Some things just needed to be acknowledged, accepted, allowed to exist. Without breaking eye contact, I turned my hand in his, lacing our fingers together properly for the first time. The gesture was small, but felt monumental, like everything that had led us to this moment suddenly clicking into place with the satisfying precision of a properly fitted part. Neither of us spoke for a long moment, just sat there with our hands intertwined, letting the weight of what we'd finally admitted settle around us like the golden dust motes dancing in the evening light. The choice hung between us like something physical, tangible in the charged air of the shop. Our fingers were still intertwined, warm and slightly damp with nervous sweat, but I could feel the weight of what came next pressing down on both of us. The admission had been made. The truth was out there between us, impossible to ignore or take back. But knowing something and acting on it were different territories entirely. Damien's thumb moved slowly across my knuckles, a gesture that had become familiar over these weeks, but felt different now. Heavier, loaded with intention rather than careful testing of boundaries. His eyes searched my face like he was reading the fine print of my expression, looking for any sign of hesitation or regret. I could see the question forming in the tension around his mouth, in the way his breathing had gone shallow and careful. Could feel him weighing the same risk I was weighing. The distance between where we were and where this could lead us. The space between safety and something that might change everything. When he spoke, his voice was rougher than usual, like the words were harder to shape than mechanical explanations or casual conversation. "If we do this," he said slowly, his grip tightening slightly around my fingers, "there's no pretending after. Now going back to just being the guy who fixes your car and the guy who sits in that chair reading books he's not really paying attention to." The honesty of it hit me somewhere deep in my chest. This wasn't a casual proposition or a moment of impulse that could be laughed off later if it went wrong. He was asking me to choose something real, something that would reshape the careful boundaries we'd built around our friendship. I thought about all the ways this could complicate things. How I'd have to find a new mechanic if it went badly. How the garage would stop being my refuge if awkwardness replaced the easy comfort we'd built together. How my careful, planned-out life would have to make room for something unpredictable and potentially messy. But looking at him in the golden light, at the patient certainty in his expression and the way his rough hands held mine like something precious, those concerns felt distant and theoretical. What felt real was the warmth spreading through my chest, the way my pulse had picked up speed, the growing certainty that I'd been moving toward this choice for weeks without fully admitting it to myself. "I don't want to pretend," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "I'm tired of pretending." Something shifted in his expression, then, relief mixing with something deeper, more intense. Like I'd given him permission for something he'd been holding back for longer than just these past few weeks. He moved closer, or maybe I did. Later, I wouldn't be able to say who initiated the closing of that last small distance between us. But suddenly his free hand was cupping my jaw, thumb brushing across my cheekbone with the same careful attention he brought to delicate repairs. The kiss started tentative, almost questioning, like he was still giving me space to change my mind. But when I leaned into him, when my hand found its way to the back of his neck and felt the warm skin there, he deepened it. The careful control he maintained over everything else dissolved, replaced by something hungrier, more urgent. It tasted like possibility and motor oil, like the coffee we'd shared and the honest sweat of real work. Like something I'd been hungry for without knowing what I was missing. His mouth was warm and slightly chapped, and when he made a small sound against my lips, I felt it resonate somewhere deep in my chest. We broke apart only when breathing became necessary, foreheads touching, both of us slightly out of breath. The shop felt different around us now, transformed by what had just happened. The familiar sounds, the hum of the fan, the distant traffic outside, seemed muted, less important than the sound of our breathing and the rapid pulse I could feel where his thumb rested against my throat. "This changes everything," he said quietly, but he didn't sound worried about it. If anything, he sounded relieved, like he'd been carrying the weight of wanting this for longer than I'd realized. "I know," I said, and found that I wasn't worried either. Not about the complications or the questions this would raise, or the ways my carefully ordered life would have to stretch to accommodate something this real. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Not planning for some future version of happiness. Not analyzing whether my choices were smart or safe or likely to lead to the outcomes I thought I wanted. Just here in this grease-stained garage with a man whose hands knew how to fix things, who saw through my careful excuses to what I actually needed, who'd been patient enough to wait for me to catch up to what he'd understood from the beginning. The transmission he'd been working on sat forgotten, tools scattered across the workbench like evidence of the moment, when everything else had become secondary to this. To us. But neither of us moved to clean up, to return to the pretense of work or the comfortable distance of friendship. Instead, we stayed close, hands still linked, breathing the same air in the golden light of the day that had become something entirely different from what I'd expected when I walked through the door. The choice had been made, not just in words or in the press of lips against lips, but in the way we held each other in the aftermath, like people who'd found something worth the risk of everything that came next. Later, after the sun had set completely and the shop had settled into the deep quiet of evening, we found ourselves sitting on the workbench where this had all begun. The transmission still waited, half disassembled, surrounded by tools we'd abandoned when more pressing matters demanded our attention. Neither of us had mentioned finishing the work. Some things, it seemed, could wait until tomorrow. The overhead fluorescents had been switched off, leaving only the single lamp clamped to the edge of the bench to push back the darkness. It cast everything in warm, intimate light. The scattered wrenches, the coffee cups gone cold, our hands resting between us on the scarred metal surface. We hadn't talked much since the kiss. Didn't seem to need words for what was settling between us. This new understanding that felt both monumental and perfectly natural. Like something that had been inevitable from that first afternoon when he'd wiped grease from my wrist and held on longer than necessary. My shoulder pressed against his, and I could feel the steady rhythm of his breathing, the warmth of his skin through the thin cotton of his work shirt. There was something peaceful about the contact, unhurried and easy in a way that surprised me. I'd expected awkwardness, the fumbling uncertainty that comes with crossing lines you can't uncross. Instead, this felt like coming home. He shifted slightly, and I felt his fingers brush against mine on the workbench surface. Not grabbing or holding, just the gentle pressure of acknowledgement, of presence. When I looked down, I could see the contrast between our hands. His broader, marked with the permanent evidence of his work, small scars and calluses that told the story of years spent fixing things. Mine softer, but no longer completely clean, bearing their own new marks from these weeks of learning to work beside him. The grease under my fingernails had become familiar now, a badge of belonging I no longer try to scrub away completely. Evidence that I'd been here, that I'd found a place where my careful, academic hands could learn to do something real and immediate and useful. "It's quiet," I said finally, more to fill the comfortable silence than because anything needed to be said. He nodded, thumb moving against my knuckles in that gesture that had become as natural as breathing. Always is this time of night. One of the things I love about this place. During the day, it's all noise and rush, people wanting things fixed right now, engines complaining, phones ringing. But after hours, it's just peaceful. I understood what he meant. The garage felt different in this light, more intimate than it ever had during my afternoon visits. Like a secret space that belonged only to us, where the outside world couldn't intrude with its demands and expectations and questions about what this meant or where it was leading. Think anyone would care? I asked, though I wasn't sure exactly what I was asking about. Us, I meant this. The fact that the quiet college kid had fallen for the mechanic who'd been patient enough to let him figure it out. He was quiet for a moment, considering. Some people might, he said honestly, but not the people who matter. The simplicity of it, the straightforward way he approached even this potential complication, made something ease in my chest. I've been so worried about analyzing every angle, about what my parents would think or how my roommate would react or whether this fit into any of the careful plans I'd made for my life. But sitting here in the warm circle of lamplight, our hands touching on the workbench where he'd taught me the honest satisfaction of fixing things that were broken, those concerns felt distant and unimportant. What mattered was this moment, this choice we'd made, this quiet certainty that we'd found something worth keeping. We stayed like that until well past closing time, shoulders touching, hands linked loosely between us, watching the way the light caught on the tools scattered across the bench. No rush to define what we were now or plan what came next. Just the weight of his presence beside me and the growing understanding that some of the best things happen when you stop trying to control the outcome. When we finally cleaned up and turned off the lamp, when he locked the shop behind us and walked me to my car in the cool night air, the kiss goodnight was softer than the first one. Less desperate, more certain, like something we had time to savor now instead of rushing toward before we lost our nerve. "I'll see you tomorrow?" he asked, though it sounded more like a statement than a question. "Yeah," I said, keys warm in my palm for where he'd pressed them there. "You will." Driving home through the empty streets, I caught myself smiling at nothing in particular. The radio played something low and sweet, and for once I wasn't thinking 3 steps ahead or worrying about whether I was making the right choices. I was just thinking about the way his hands had felt holding mine, about the patient certainty in his voice when he'd said the people who mattered wouldn't care, about tomorrow afternoon and the comfortable rhythm we'd built together, now deepened into something that felt solid and real and worth whatever complications might come. The grease stain on my wrist had long since faded, washed away by time and soap and the normal business of living. But the memory of that first touch lingered, transformed now into something larger. Proof that sometimes the smallest gestures, a hand held a moment too long, attention paid when it isn't required, the willingness to let someone see you clearly, can change everything. Some things I was learning didn't need to be fixed because they were never broken in the first place. They just needed to be recognized for what they already were.